So we can get restarted. So my name's Tom Metcalfe. I work for Roche Pharmaceuticals, and it's my pleasure to be here with this esteemed group of panelists. The first person I'd like to introduce is online. So Andrew Thomson from the EMA. Then going, hi Andrew, glad that you can make it.
Thanks for inviting me.
And then we have Dr. Jesper Kjær, who's head of the Danish Medicines Agency Data Analytics Center. And next to him, we have Dr. Enzing, who's a policy advisor for the Netherlands National Healthcare Institute. Next to him, we have Dr. Jørgen Kristensen, who's chairman of the Danish Medicines Council and medical director of the Aarhus University Hospital.
Used to.
Lastly, we have Jolanda Koenders, who's head of new product planning at Takeda, Netherlands. So thank you all for joining us. Thank you for the Danish Foreign Ministry for hosting us here. I don't know how many of you usually read the OECD report on what's it called? Healthcare. State of healthcare, but that which just came out last week. Very interestingly, I think this is no big change actually for the Danish, but pretty much on every aspect of health data across the OECD countries, Denmark ranks the top. So availability, interoperability, governance. I think on most of those matrices, Denmark ranks at the top. So it's great to be here in Denmark discussing health data and health outcomes data in this setting. So I think all of us heard the perspectives, I think mostly looking at if we think of that chart that Tanya showed about the four purposes which the Health Outcomes Observatory are trying to enable. The first panel, I think, focused primarily on the primary use of the data. So enabling better interactions between patients and healthcare givers and enabling providers to optimize care pathways in the provider setting. So I think it's better if we, in this panel, sort of focus a little bit more on the secondary uses. So that would be more at the innovation perspective and at the healthcare policy perspective. And so when we think about these aspects, what do we have to do when we're thinking about using PRO data collected in clinical settings to make these data useful for the purposes that we're looking to make them useful for? I think one of the obvious things that I think many talked about this is, ensuring good scientific rigor. But are there other aspects that we have to do? And also when we think about ensuring that we have scientific rigor underpinning the data collection and the evidence generation from the data, what do we have to pay attention to? How much do we have to ensure that there's interoperability and consistency between data that we generate in clinical trial settings and data that we generate in clinical care settings? So maybe I'd give Andrew the first opportunity to talk about this as you're online, Andrew, and then we'll sort of try and unpack this, looking also at challenges related to that and opportunities related to that as we go around the panel. So Andrew.
Thanks, Tom, and thanks for giving me the opportunity to join the panel this afternoon. So I think that one of the challenges is making sure that we know what decision makers are going to be using this data for and who those decision makers are. And of course, they may all have slightly different motivations, whether that be regulators, payers, patients, and prescribers as well. So firstly, the important challenge is making sure that the question that the data is supposed to answer is well understood. Secondly, the fitness for purpose of that data. That's something that historically, from a regulatory point of view, has often, for example, been done through GCP inspections. But as we move into a more digital world, and decision makers need to think about what data they need, we have to think about how do we assess the fitness and purpose of the data that we have. From our point of view as regulators, I think we're perhaps quite well known for considering PROs as to being a very nice to have rather than necessarily a need to have in all situations. But we appreciate that other decision makers and downstream people from our decisions will actually put a lot more weight on this data. So the question is, how can we enable this data to be captured in a clinical trial in an adequate way? And that's meaningful as well. And it is a trade-off, that balance between making sure that we can record the information without it being a burden upon those who involved in the trial, primarily participants, but also investigators as well. So I think it's important to reflect that there is that trade-off and that balance, but also that we have tools that we can use to make that less onerous and make that balance a more reasonable one to make. And then another thing to think about perhaps for the future is that there is in many quarters a big push for bringing clinical trials in general closer to the point of care. It's a particular push from the US where maybe there might be a bigger gap between kind of the trial sites and where a lot of patients might receive their care. Perhaps it is smaller in at least some European countries. But nevertheless, if we are going to be moving to clinical trials trying to capture that kind of data, then making sure that we're aligned, making sure that it's meaningful, making sure that patients want to provide it is all part of a bigger picture ecosystem that allows clinical research in general to flourish within the EU. Thanks.
Thank you, Andrew. So maybe if I just turn to maybe Jesper next, and Andrew talked about using PRO or collecting PRO data in clinical trials. But when we think about sort of overall about the continuum of evidence between clinical trials and real world evidence, what are the aspects that you think we have to pay attention to, and the challenges and opportunities related to use of PRO data from in a real world perspective and in a real world setting?
So I'm happy we have this order, Andrew, so you could kind of do this nice lean into this. Thank you. So there's the discussion we just had about the primary use of that is really important for the value and secondary use, right? So it's all about making sure that it was actually clinical relevant for why that initial data was collected, because that obviously then makes it relevant for us to look in the secondary use of that data. And I have to admit that although we have some examples from central Danish region about this being really flourishing, that's not to say it's the same thing across Europe, not necessarily in every single region in Denmark either necessarily. So there's some harmonization, which I really appreciate H2O is trying to, in collaboration with others, to drive, because you need to have this at scale, and you need to have it at scale where we start to see this become almost a commodity in how you generate data, because that's the beauty of real world evidence, at least in the Nordic countries, or real world data in Nordic countries, is without bias, right? And it really makes sense towards what we have captured for what purpose, where in the healthcare system. We need to get to the same level on this data for it to really become valuable. It's highly well defined and controlled in clinical trials. That's why it's so easy and elegant to use. It may be more difficult if what you get are small drops of data here, there, left, right, and center. It becomes really difficult. And then there's a different aspect to that, which I think we have discussed at different venues. Last year, we had the patient experience data workshop as well at the EMA, where H2O was present to talk to this. And we will talk about this in the afternoon on the Big Data Stakeholder Forum on the 4th of December as well. There's a need to understand where the data is. I guess you may all have data source available, yet we don't have an overview where to go and find that data and who to interact with to use the data for secondary use. It's far more mature on the clinical data, on the prescription data, on the diagnosis data, vital signs, what else not, but not on the PROs yet. And there we're going to make the push for the catalog of real-world data sources in Europe, really trying to ask people and stimulate them to populate that with information. So according to the FAIR principles, data then becomes findable, accessible. I appreciate if they're standardized, they are interoperable, but also should get to a point that they become reusable. And once we achieve that, it will definitely become a very important instrument in the hand of regulators. We are looking into so many use cases where that could really be valuable. Aging population with chronic diseases, with polypharmacy situation, with comorbidities, all of that, that's where you need to understand what is the patient journey. What is the level of compliance with treatment you seem to take for years and years and years, because we don't have a cure yet, probably will take a number of decades before we do. It becomes so important to understand why there's lack of compliance, why there's better compliance other places, what's the tolerability, where we don't get the side effect reports, but people just go off the treatment and we don't hear why. That's actually important. So,
great. I mean, I think those are, really important considerations. And as you say, we're starting out on this journey.
Yeah.
And I think this is part of what we as H2O are trying to do, is to demonstrate first of all, the proof of principle that this can be done at a reasonable scale. But it's also, I think, just planting the seed, and I think we all need the community collectively to nurture that seed. So, yeah. Joost, when you think about this from the Dutch perspective, and I mean, you're also looking at this more from broadly from a healthcare policy perspective, rather than, I'm not saying this is a narrow regulatory perspective, but that's what are some of the considerations that you see with respect to how we think about the interoperability of this data, and what we need to take into consideration to make the data useful, and to promote the use of or the collection of the data so that it is useful?
So first of all, as the Dutch National Healthcare Institute aims to have appropriate care for patients, for all Dutch citizens, and shared decision making is one of the aspects of appropriate care. So this is, although this may be for the first session, this is really important also for the Dutch Healthcare Institute. And secondly, we also want the healthcare system to be a learning system. So then it's also a reason why to be really happy with the H2O initiative. And then, of course, as a HTA body, we are hungry for information, for data. So we really look forward to use these PROs. For example, when we have the flash glucose monitor included to the reimbursement package, we like to see if is it really helping people to have a better life. And also when recently, like breast reconstruction with a body-owned fat is more expensive, but it has the claim to make life better. So we want to watch and maybe reassess. But if this threat of reassessment influences doctors and patients and make them more reluctant to fill in the forms, or to ask their patients to fill in the form, I think that there's a tension there, because also there's an option for opt-out for patients. So the secondary use should be really good governed, and the privacy issue should be, and we should be honest about this use to not spoil the primary use. So that's what I'm thinking about when thinking about this topic.
I mean, I think that to me as well is such an important design principle to ensure that secondary, you want to enable as much secondary use as possible, but the secondary use should never really endanger the primary use. Otherwise, you've got something wrong from a design perspective. Jørgen, when you think about this from a medicines perspective, do you think it's too early to be thinking about using the PRO data, which is collected in real world settings, to do anything in terms of assessing medicine's efficacy, or should we be already conceiving of that as we start on this journey? I mean, what's your perspective related to that?
I think we're too late, because we've got lots of data. Thank you for mentioning the OECD report. But I think even in Denmark, where we've got lots of centralized data, lots of it, and we are practically not using it for anything concerning clinical questions and concerning regulation. So chairing a HTA body in Denmark, where we recommend drugs for hospital use, and the clinicians, they do follow the advice. We need to evaluate new drugs and old drugs along the way, and we're not doing that. We're just putting in new drugs, and we hope somebody will accumulate data, real-world data, and perhaps somebody someday will think about real-world evidence, but we're not doing it in a systematic way. So I would love to be part of a collaboration movement between patient, clinicians, companies, HTA bodies, regulators, to create the sentence, let's learn from every treatment. We have the possibility, but we are not doing it, which is kind of strange. And second, I love the primary discussion and the first panel. If we do not let the primary use be the first one, the primary, then we cannot use it for secondary purposes, because the data will either be corrupted or non-existing. So perhaps we should try in the real world to have learning from every treatment. We've even made a national registry. Every treatment given at hospitals in Denmark is at the same day reported to the national registry. Mm-hmm. The data are there. We're not using them. If we went together, if we approved a new treatment, let's follow all the patients who are actually treated, how do they fare, and use the pros used in the primary setting to ask the question, how are you doing, patient? Not clinician, how is the patient doing? But patient, how are you doing? That could be very interesting.
And so listening to what you're saying, I think there's two things I'm hearing. One is that we almost have a duty to begin to use these data in a systematic way. And I guess this comes back to the learning healthcare system, that we will only get a learning healthcare system when we begin to use these data effectively. I mean, I think one of the things related to healthcare costs is that we know that most healthcare systems are pretty wasteful in many different respects. That the OECD as well estimates something like 20% of healthcare spend is not productively used in terms of driving better outcomes for patients. So that I think is almost a collective duty to begin to learn from essentially from all of the interactions that we can, and to collect that data systematically. But the other piece is the PRO piece. Is do you think that PRO data is reliable enough to contribute to that learning, or is it still not scientifically rigorously enough used? Is the scientific rigor underlying the design and collection of this data not rigorous enough to enable us to use it in those sorts of decision making? What's your perspective on that?
I'm a practical hematologist, so I wouldn't discuss it that long. I think I'll just say, let's try it in some areas to use the pro data and see if it works. We need to evaluate in large scale what is bad and what is good about it. And we'll find out if you can extract evidence from it.
We will, I guess, learn along the way
Yes.
Yeah.
The problem right now is we are not starting.
Jolanda, when you think about this from the industry perspective, and some of the I guess the uses that industry could derive from having large outcome sets at scale, how do you think this can help improve the way we innovate medicines development and also bring medicines to patients which better fit their needs. So when you think about this from an industry perspective, what's your view on the broadly on the usefulness of these outcome data sets, integrated outcome data sets?
Yeah. Well, to answer that, I would like to give you a perspective on why we even have a challenge and a need for PROs. Because I not only represent the Netherlands in new product planning, but also 25 other countries. So if I ask my countries, if you want to launch this asset in a couple of years, what data would you need? There's one thing that joins them is that they want patient-reported outcomes, often for reimbursement assessments, of course. They want EQ5D, but then also in relation to that alignment, they ask 48 other PROs because Slovakia needs this, Greece needs this, Israel needs this. So there's a whole list that I'm going to say, we need a clinical study with 50 PROs. Well, we just learned that even one PRO with an hour of an assessment is not feasible. Plus, it's also not feasible to run a study with 50 PROs because then probably the length will be, I don't know, huge. So in the end, it's a Dutch model. We do a consensus. We often choose one or two, which are the ones that are mostly accepted. And then for the rest, there's nothing. So for the rest, we often look at what is then available, what can we use, what is indeed scientifically accepted, what PROs are scientifically validated. And those are the data, the evidence we probably will need to go in each of the countries to have a discussion like, is this what we can use to enrich the dossier, have a dialogue with regulators, with payers on that. In addition to enrichment of your evidence and really combining clinical data with clinical practice, I guess it also fits your suggestion to learn from every treatment. At the moment the drug is included in the basic package, you could say, why not use the PROs to do outcome-based reimbursement, see whether the drug works, and if not, based on PROs that you standardize and you agree upon upfront, you could also say, okay, this drug doesn't work for this patient or for this subgroup or for this population, but I guess for me, it's also a great tool to increase the efficiency after the drug is assessed. So that would be my need for PROs and the way we can implement them.
Right. So I mean that I guess there's some challenges. I mean, we want to I think have good evidence initially that a medicine is essentially from a regulatory perspective is safe and effective in a clearly defined population before you'd want to go and begin to do clinical research in a real world setting. But that's, and I guess finding this equilibrium between the evidence that you want to ensure is available before you do that and ensuring that you have a real world evaluation of clinical efficacy. That's something which is going to require, I guess, a joint vision of how we can harness real world evidence effectively for regulatory decision making as well as for reimbursement decisions, HTA decisions. But that would require, I think, that we have this data available at a reasonable scale, and we have effective systems to generate robust evidence to support that. Jesper and Andrew, you're both involved from a Darwin perspective in terms of designing how regulators in Europe can begin to harness real-world evidence. Are PROs a key part of that design thinking at the moment, or is this something which you think is more emergent? And
it's more emergent. And it is because, to some of the points I mentioned earlier, that going and finding the big, vast data source really isn't available right now. So, and the effort we spend here is right now to find the big data sources that really answer the big questions, also give a bit of variety in different questions we can answer with the data sources. Whether down the route that there will be a patient-reported outcome database, quite likely. But it also remains to be identified. That's why we are requesting people come forward to kind of tell us what are the data sources out there, because we know some of them, but not all of them. But again, the other data sources are just so much more available than PRO data sources.
Yeah, I mean, that I guess is looking at what's, as you say, what's out there, what's extant. But when you think about, I mean, do you believe, or I guess does a regulatory community broadly believe that it would be important to begin to collect this data at scale? And if so, who should be the designers, initiators? Who should be the proponents of that?
Well, I think
maybe you know, Jørgen, you've been provocative in terms of saying that we need to do this. We should have been doing it yesterday. Do you have a perspective on that?
I think we need to do it because right now we are inventing a lot of new drugs and new treatments, and the approval system will put them on the market fast, which is good, but also a little bit risky. And the amount of data we've got is smaller than it used to be. And in that setting, I think we should learn from every treatment, even though we cannot have the perfect data source. Mm-hmm. We must go with what we've got and then try to build new ones. And I think that's in a common interest of companies and countries, regulators, whatever.
The whole community.
The community, patients, because we need to know faster what are the results in a bigger setting.
So this is, if I'm understanding correctly, this is more or less, we should learn from every exposure. I mean, that's from early through to late, we should try and learn as much as we can from every exposure, and then in the learning healthcare system, thinking to harness that. And sometimes I guess we will have less data from an exposure, and sometimes we will have more, but we have to try and pull that patchwork together as effectively as we can to make good decisions on behalf of patients.
Let's learn what we can in every case, not wait until we can what is perfect or better. Let's try something.
So don't let perfect be the enemy of good enough.
Yes.
Good.
Tom, can I interject here?
Yeah, absolutely, Andrew. Please do.
So, I mean, historically, there's been three major questions unanswered at the point of licensure, primarily long-term safety, very rare events, and the external validity of the clinical trial, i.e. it's going to be used in a wider patient population. But I think it has been correctly alluded to, there has been an increase in the conditional marketing authorization procedure and the use of that within the EU, where we grant medicines a license based on earlier trial results than previously, but it does come with a condition, and it's always required to kind of back that up with the harder outcomes. Oftentimes it's used in oncology, oftentimes it's based on a very, very impressive response rate, but further down the line mortality data comes into it. I think and it's very much aligned to what Jesper said, that the big question really is the external validity of trials. And we say, okay, it's going to be used with polypharmacy, it's going to be used in an older population. Every clinical trial has an eldest participant. The real world will be an older person than that. There's going to be many situations. Now, that's not to assume per se that there's always going to be a problem that needs to be addressed, but we do need to think carefully about how we can assure the external validity of our trials and have access to the data sources that provide that reassurance that really is correct. Thanks.
Well, thank you, Andrew. we've got a question on Slido. One challenge to the success of H2O and other PRO collection efforts may be that it creates another data silo among many. What are the expectations? What expectations are there for integration and access to the data for stakeholders? Is it different nationally versus internationally? I mean, I think, Jesper, this comes a little back to the point that you raised about where is the data, I guess, who controls the data, who has access to the data, fair principles. And you've been quite involved, I understand, also in Eden from,
actually not. No.
Not involved in Eden, but you've...
both Andrew and I being regulators on Darwin EU, right? Obviously, as being a component of the big data steer.
The collaboration with Eden. Yeah. When you think about those fair principles and this question, I mean, what would be the recommendations that you would make to ensure that we don't end up with another data silo or something which is where accessibility is a challenge?
I think from the European side, and European Commission has already embraced fair principles in the past and still support that. And I think with the undertaking of the European health data space, obviously now creates a platform and also over the years mechanisms to ensure you find a place in which you can actually, with data permit authorities, go and request access to that data. So I think we are going to take that route in Europe, right? That our data permit authorities will be the point of entry for these kind of data. And I think that will be a benefit to all of us. That will not have not only 27 member state approaches to it, we'll have one approach to it. We'll actually have an approach that allows to get access to that data across borders over the years to come. I think that's a major step forward, right? In order to ensure that this data will actually be useful, accessible, and it will be demanded to be interoperable, so and reusable through that. And I think that also goes with the Danish setting, right? That we are bringing all of that together. We're already doing it, but we actually have an office at the Danish Health Data Permit Authority that deals with the PROs in this country and ensures that we do harmonize on these topics. And we need to expand on that.
Right. Maybe if I come to Jørgen, you again, I mean, I think what Jesper's just touching on is when you think about this from a public sector perspective, do you think that anything has to be done to ensure that that the private sector, I mean, you talked a little bit about the multi-stakeholder involvement, that the private sector has also the right incentives to create this sort of data and make it available to you know, in a multi-stakeholder setting?
I hope they have. Together with Jesper, I agree that the EHDS is very important in this regulation. Looking forward to seeing it working, because right now it's just a paper, but I hope it will be forward and will have a life on it. And I'm not sure that there's I trust the industry to take care of the data they collect and do it openly and contribute to the learning from every patient. That needs to be done that way. But I'm confident that companies will see the value of going into this learning from every treatment.
And I guess invest appropriately in that. I mean, I think those points about, you know, having appropriate regulation in place, having legal frameworks such as the EHDS, which ensure that that what is legitimately seen as a public good is treated in the right way. I mean, I think those are really important underpinnings to...
Just a comment to this, also GDPR really is a mechanism also for industry to actually collect the data through consent.
Yeah,
absolutely.
You have a mechanism to do that. So obviously we fully embrace that. If that happens and you treat the data as you should according to that consent, please. But let's also make sure that that consent also deals with, you can actually share that with regulators and researchers, because that's where the value also sits, the reuse of that data, right?
Yeah, great points, absolutely. Yolanda, you.
Well, maybe to add about the incentive for pharmaceutical industry. I already mentioned that we can use the evidence to enrich our own clinical data, but and outcome-based reimbursement. But we could also do pragmatic trials on real-world evidence, that we shorten the time for clinical research, for example, making hopefully these assets available to patients earlier. We probably need to innovate on that, but I guess there are already great examples on that. And the other thing that I thought of was digital tools. I just visited ISPOR yesterday. Artificial intelligence was a great topic, also digital tools. A lot of these apps and tools are developed by private partners. And I guess also if we are collecting this in the right way and that it is of high quality, then also we can leverage our tools better to be able to really create value for patients, for doctors, doing that on the primary side, having that conversation, but also as a great way to collect evidence that we can use for decision making. So I guess for us, that's also an incentive. And maybe one reflection on the question here about the success of H2O, which I'm really happy that it's framed this way. I guess for me, being involved in H2O was also part that it is a use case and learning environment to see if we can build trust in data. And yes, it will not answer everything, but if we have to wait until that perfect answer, then we all know that it will take a while. So I'm already glad that we are starting to experiment and learn what is working, what isn't working, or maybe this is working in the Netherlands, this isn't working in Spain. Can we maybe share something or steal what is working in Austria and implement it in Germany? So I guess for me, H2O is also creating that learning environment. And in the end, putting then trust in the data that it's of high quality, scientific rigor, that we can use it for all of these purposes.
Right. Thank you, Yolanda. Just like to maybe open to the floor if there's any questions from the floor or comments. Benny, you've got one question? Okay, hang on.
Thank you. Very interesting discussion. And I have a question. So, which is common sense. So in the regulators agree what would be the PROs that they would like to see in a clinical trial as a nice to have, as I understand it. You've mentioned Andrew, but they have, and there is the clinical trial finishes and a drug is being taken to the market. And then what I understand we've all agreed is that it would be really nice if there is some type of PRO usage in the clinical practice, not necessarily for that drug, but more generally, so that there is this collection of data. I think we all agree to that. What I'm not clear is how will that happen? So what will be, who will decide what it is that we are measuring in clinical practice and why? Why would a hospital do that and another hospital, or why would the healthcare system do that? And why this and not something else? So before my thinking, my assumption is that, and that's big part of the philosophy underlying the H2O, is that something like the pan-European H2O could be a forum where these conversations could happen. So it could be a place to decide, okay, what should be measured? What is the appropriate thing to measure in lung cancer, in breast cancer, and make some kind of recommendation that could then give some deal. This could be the objective, could be the result of a multi-stakeholder consensus and could give some direction. What do you think about this concept, and what would be the other alternatives in your opinion?
Anybody want to field that?
Well,
Just have a go. I think we still need to remember that primary use is actually the primary use for PROs. And without primary use, it's very difficult to make secondary use because they won't exist. So we need to respect the primary use and sustain it and help them. And we could perhaps help them a lot. because then we can better use them for secondary uses. On the way, I think we will try to make more multi-stakeholder system, trying to negotiate between regulators and HTA bodies and patients organizations and drug companies on, could we perhaps have a little bit of secondary use questions in the PROs? But I think we should have the respect for the primary use all the way, because otherwise it just disappears. No, it's difficult, but the incentive for the primary use has to be there.
So I think, I absolutely support that perspective. I guess there may be sort of just one conceptual overlay on top of that, which is, can you do something which is minimal, which helps with the interoperability across countries from a design perspective, that you design in a minimum of interoperability that doesn't interfere with the primary use, but enables greater secondary use. Is that, do you think that's achievable, or is that, do we more or less have to live with the entropy which might arrive from everybody wanting to optimize for a particular primary use?
I hope and I believe it's possible to have a dialogue and put a minimum of
Design
domains into it. I really hope. I believe it as well. But it needs work, needs experience in the real world.
And I guess needs dialogue between the stakeholders as well. Absolutely, yeah. Joost, do you want it?
Because if you would ask me, everybody should have to fill in the EQ 5D because I'm a health economist. But I understand that as a doctor, you don't want to ask someone to fill in mobility questions when it's not an issue for this person. So, but are there any data points that are interesting for secondary use, which are not interesting for primary use, or is it in the if you boil it all down, is it the same? Or I'm not sure, but these people are also part of the round table, so maybe one knows.
This, so Matthias, you're thought about this a lot, so.
Yeah, maybe to answer your question, yes, there's. I would say there is a difference. If you fill out the EQ50 or you fill out something which is very specifically, or even if you think of the 5 domains. So, but I also would like to stress what Manny just mentioned. I think there's a window of opportunity as far as I perceive this right now, that there's a. We're consulting in a way the IQM clinics, which are 500 clinics in Germany, and they are really looking for some kind of, they are interested in on a very basic system. They would love to start with something. So, and I think to reduce the entropy, so if there would be a signal from somebody and with some kind of authority, let's start with that. I think we could make our life for secondary use much easier than we just let them run. I think I totally share the optimism, but I'm also a little bit afraid that we encourage people to do something and then they will just very much customize this to their needs, which is a good thing. But then it takes us a lot of work afterwards, which could have been prevented without a lot of making the primary use less useful. And to your question, I think there are combinations to do that. Once you engaged, at least it's the way we do it at the moment, we think it's probably will fly, is that we say the basic domains for the patient perspective is always health. So it's not a disease perspective. And these are the 8 domains which are usually very well accepted over many, many years. So it's physical functioning, pain, fatigue, depression. Fatigue is useful obviously to know in heart failure, but it's also useful to do it in kidney diseases, or it's also useful. But we don't want to measure fatigue in a very specific way for cancer. I think you can do this, but I think it wouldn't be wise. So these 8 domains are relevant for everybody, informative, but also relevant as a generic outcome. But that's, like the ECO5D, maybe a little bit more sophisticated from the psychometrics. And then we can easily go on top, at least, with some kind of monitoring use, for what we discussed in the first round, to say, well, I'm interested if there's diarrhea, if there's fever, something like this. The good thing to combine this, in my view, is we enable a digital system to do it for the primary use. I'm interested in diarrhea, but it wouldn't hurt if the patient gets after 3 months something which is interested for the stuff which you are discussing. After 3 months, you get the information. Is somebody on a certain asset or some biologically doing well, means have a good quality of life, because they're used to answer the questions to the primary doctor. Do you have diarrhea? So I think there can be a wise combination of both, because the patient, they don't know in any instant why we are collecting this. So it's not unusual if you're asking, what is your health status? Although it might not be so informative for the physician to have the generic health status. I hope that's this kind of combination, I think, is an option which I believe will fulfill all the needs.
Thank you, Matthias. So, I guess that to some extent answers your question. There are some design elements that you can bring in which ensure the primacy of primary data collection, but do enough to enable the secondary uses. I guess that's the way to think about it. But it takes, as you say, it's hard work. It takes design. You need to think about the way those interact, and you need to make sure there's a certain amount of discipline injected from a psychometric perspective, that you're measuring things which are going to be informative, but obviously the primary interest is to ensure that patient, that interaction with the patient for the primary use is delivering benefit to both caregiver and to patient, or to patient and caregiver, should put the right way around. Tanya, you have a question or comment? Please do.
What you said, I think it's there will be only secondary use with primary use. So the primary use is really essential. If we don't create something which is useful in clinical practice, no one will use it, and we will not get any secondary data. And this is maybe easier with something which is like the refill data we get from populations, and which will be automatically stored in the pharmacies. But I think when we want something from the patients, we need to make it in a way that it's really nice for the patient. It gives them benefit, it gives the clinicians benefit, and then we can reuse the data for secondary use. But I think it's not, if we overburden the system and we ask people to do things only for research, they will never do it. Yeah, they will do it maybe once, yeah, just to please us, and then never again.
Thank you, Tanya. I think that's probably a good closing comment for this panel. Well, unfortunately, we can't get to that last question about the Apple Health Watch, so we'll
do for drinks.
We'll do it. We'll discuss it over drinks later on. So thank you very much to all the panelists for participating today. It's great to have you here. Thank you very much for your active participation. Thank you for your patience online, Andrew, and thanks for dialing in. Great to hear from you. So I'd like to hand over now to Meni and Tanya to wrap up this session. We've got 5 minutes, I think, to closing. So over to you to wrap up. And thanks again for the participation.
So thanks, everyone. Thanks, Tom, for the great chairing of the second panel. Thanks to all the panel speakers who have been here.
with us and also online to give these great contributions. I think we have learned a lot about PROs, and the topic, like I think what all the discussion showed, is something which we need to discuss further, and where we need to really have some, and we will have something to be set up during the European Health Data Space, or even to enable this. But I think we need projects like H2O and many other projects which work into this direction of really having something which is nice, useful for the patients and the clinicians, and which is really then also available for secondary use afterwards. So thanks everyone. Thank you for being here with us. We initially, I think my initial proposal was to have something like an online event, but many convinced me that it's better to do it in person, which is of course much nicer. So we are very thankful also to Aarhus University Hospital for setting this up here and co-hosting this together with the H2O project. And we are very interested, of course, to see you again in future events. So there will be events like this in the future, and I think it will be very good if you could also join. This time we made a little bit of use of the ISPOR conference, and maybe we will grab some more opportunities in the future. So thank you all for coming, and I hand over to Meni.
Just to say one more thank you, and also to say what I've been hearing. And you can tell me during the drinks, if I heard it right or not. So I came in asking myself a question, which is, are we right? Is this really a question? Is the PROs in clinical trials different from clinical practice? Is it important to have the PROs in clinical practice in one way or form, and in a standardized way and form? And then who's going to do it? So what I heard today is that, yes, it was a valid question. They are different. I also heard it's really important that we find a way to create collection, or to create this common language between patients and doctors in a standardized way. So the standardized PROs in clinical practice that create the real world evidence. It's really important. We are too late. We should have done it already. We should better get started and get it doing as quickly as possible, even if it's not perfect. And I also heard, but we don't quite know who is going to do it. So that's something more to discuss, because as I told you, I have ideas in my mind, but there will be opportunity for more conversations. And thanks again from my behalf. And we can tell me more during the drinks if I understood correctly or not.
Maybe one last thank you to Ren and Judith for organizing this, because it was really like chasing every one of us to put this all together. So thank you very much. Yeah, I think it was very good. Good. There will be some drinks outside. Is that right? Good. Then have a good evening.